I just want to thank everybody for coming in today. If anybody doesn't know who this is, it's Gloria Fisher. It's our absolute favorite Brit in the whole wide world. I've never met a more charming human being, and I'm so glad that we got to know her and that y'all will get to know her. She doesn't like it when we call her an expert, but she knows more about Charles Dickens than all of us. So I'm going to let her take over from here. She's going to talk a little bit about Charles Dickens' first visit to America, and we just want to thank you so much
No,
for
thank you.
sharing with us.
I'm glad you started the lead-in because I completely forgot that part, you know. Thank you all for coming and welcome. And I have to, first of all, thank this library for having me here to begin with, and thanking you and your wonderful staff, all of you, who do so much for so many of us with such happiness. And as I said before, and I said it earlier on, this is a nugget in my life. A nugget is a multifaceted gem that you look at, see, you hold on forever. And this is for how I regard this library. It's just a wonderful place. You cater to so many people, so many ages, and you give so much of your time, effort, and talent. Talent. Anyway, thank you so much for doing that. Thank you so much for putting this up. I'm not going to follow it. But first of all, I'd like to say that I have very mixed feelings about Charles Dickens. I'm an opinionated woman. I've been on this earth a very long time. And I also lived in London, very close to one of his homes. I've walked his walk, I've felt his presence, and I feel as though I have a particular connection with him, although it may not be one of an expert. I don't want it to be. My total opinion of this man is not a good one, but that's a talk for another time. I think he was something of a rascal. I did not admire him as a man. But I'm not going to go into that because today we're going to talk about, for a little bit anyway, about the reasons he came to the United States. And as I said earlier on, they were twofold. One was he was invited to come over here by Washington Irving, American, to come on over, come and see what it's like over here in this new republic. And he was giving Dickens a good feedback. But this was long before he set sail, okay? So he took, it wasn't about a year before he got going. So he thought about that and said, yeah. And the other one was he thought also that it would be a good idea to promote what he'd had in the back of his mind for a long time, and that was copyright. So those are the only two reasons that he really came here. However, you have to understand a little bit about this man. If I may digress here, to understand why he really came over, apart from the copyright. And I'm going to take you back just a little bit, if you don't mind. It's got nothing to do with this, okay? About this man. He was born, and I'm not going to go all the way back, right? But anyway, he was born to what is known in the UK as in the lower class. Class in the UK at that time, and even today, is considered extremely important in society. As long as we have the king and the queen and all the others, we've got a class system, and it will go on. Well, Dickens, he was born into what was called the lower class. He was, as a child, he was rather sickly. He did not attend school, which had to be paid for. He was the son of a man who could not control his finances, was constantly in debt, and eventually ended up in a debtor's prison, for which Dickens had to go out and work for to keep them there. Because if you went to a debtor's prison in those days, if you didn't keep yourself, you died. Or you withered away. So Dickens was sent out for a job at Warren's Blacking Factory. Warren's Blacking Factory, I'm trying to sort of cut this a bit short, to work, where he, for some time, at the age of 12, he painted labels on pots, filled them with boot black, screwed them up and sent them off to be shipped out. This was horrifying for him because the place where he was working was not in and of itself a proper place to work. It was full of rats and cats. The smells, it was overlooking the Thames River, which, as I said before, stank to high heaven. He was surrounded by people committing all kinds of crimes on the outside. It was something that had tremendous impact on him for the rest of his life. After the debt was paid by Dickens' senior relative, I think his parents died and left him a little something, so that he was able to get out of Marshalsea, and Dickens was then able to go back to school for a short time. But when you look at the time, from the time he was born to the time he was 15, when he actually got a job, his education was very, very little, very little. His mother actually taught him how to read. And he was an avid reader. He had tremendous memory, very bright young man. But he never really had much formal education. He was living in a class system. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, right? Then he got a job. He sort of recorded sessions. He worked for a legal firm, and then he worked for a court system where he recorded. He learned how to do a shorthand. And he started recording all the notes and things which he would then get copied in by other newspapers. So he started to make a little name for himself, and that's when he started to write little stories. Well, he got very bored with this whole thing, going and listening to all these court cases. It didn't really appeal to him. And he was so bored that at night, when he left, he would go into the heart and into the filth of London, and this is where he started to pick up his ideas of characters, places, things, and he sort of became attached to, they say, the paranormal. They say things which are not so nice in life, that he had a thing about this, okay? But at the same time, he was now beginning to get known. His Pickwick Papers now were over in the United States. Everybody was reading Pickwick Papers, installment by installment. They loved it. So he was getting a name over here. The Americans now, the middle-class readers of this country, they say, had 3 books in their houses. One was, Pilgrim's Progress. The other was Pickwick Papers. And the other one was the Bible. Okay, that's what they had. And they were very happy to have their evening soirees with entertainment by Dickens at least once a month. So he became very well known. But Washington Irving was sending him back all this information, and Dickens was getting quite chuffed. So when Washington Irving invited him to come over, he thought, maybe, at the same time this was going on, the Industrial Revolution was well underway in the UK. A lot of different types of things were being made, and they were being printed in the newspaper, and Dickens' reputation now was getting a little bit dulled. Now, just before I go on any further, there was a woman he met a little later on called Angela Burdett Coutts. She was a very rich woman who inherited a bank called Coutts Bank, which happened to be the bank which was assigned to the Crown, and still is to this day. She knew this man very well, and she said that he was bombastic, he was irritable, that he was a a charlatan. She had all kinds of names for this man. And I actually believe this to be true. He was very self-aware. A lot of people don't realize that he actually was a man who stood about 5'8", and if all the portraits you ever see of this man, they're from here up, except one, where they show him with very thin, puny little legs. And it makes you wonder, you know, what's going on with this man. But every portrait that was taken is nothing really in bright colour. And yet we know from other records that the one thing he used to do was love to dress up. He wanted attention. He wanted to be in the limelight. This is how he thrived. A lot of people don't seem to realise that I think he was a nutcase, to tell you the truth. And I've got a lot to say about that, but not today. Okay? But anyway, so this is one of the reasons that I think he came to the United States, was to blow his ego up a little bit, you see? Because after all, this is the great Dickens coming over. And we're going from here. So, 1 January in 1842, he decided to set sail. And instead of setting sail from a port which was closer to home, he decided to travel all the way up to Liverpool. Now, you know who else came from Liverpool, don't you?
The Beatles.
The Beatles, right? Okay. Interesting connection here. So he set sail from Liverpool in January. Why he chose January, God only knows, to cross the Atlantic. But in those days, you know, weather forecasts weren't very eminent. Nobody really cared, or they sort of took a chance. So he set sail on a boat called the Britannia, which was one of the Cunard lines. It was only a boat which was only 207 feet long and 30 feet wide. And according to what I read, it could accommodate at least 72 passengers. Think about that. Its cargo, it was a steamship, and its cargo was mainly coal and other things, packages which the ship was actually assigned to do. In addition to the coal, the ship had rats from end to end, and cats. This is where cats come in useful, John. The ship had a lot of cats on board. So anyway, Dickens and his wife, and he had his wife had a maid. Her name was Anne Brown. They had 4 children by then. He was only 29 when this happened. They had 4 children, which they left behind in charge of Dickens' sister-in-law called Georgina. That's another story. The whole thing of his people living in his house is a whole other thing about why I don't like this man, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. Well, we might get to it, I don't know. So they set sail on January the 2nd, 1842. No sooner had they got down into the Atlantic, there's this terrible storm. And according to some writings, Dickens suffered for 3 days, his wife for 4 days, another you see 5 days, and then another one you see the whole journey. You really don't know what is true. But they did suffer on this journey a lot, and according to Dickens' own writing, he had a hard time controlling the movements of his wife and the maid, who was sitting on a couch in their very small cabin, for which he could not even get his trunk through the door. There's no record of exactly what this cabin was like. Did they have water? Did they have somewhere to go and take ablutions? There's no record of this. So in my mind, I'm thinking they're getting smellier by the day.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, you don't have to say that, because I'll tell you why in a minute. So this journey was horrible. They were throwing up all the time, and Dickens, now we know that he drank brandy a lot, had his little brandy thing, and he was trying to calm both his wife and her maid with this brandy, but he couldn't get to them because they kept slouching from one end of the couch to the other as the ship went like this. This went on practically for the entire journey. So at the end of this time, this was like, I think it was 19 days it took to cross the Atlantic. Imagine that, in a ship like this. Now, excuse me, when I came over here, just an aside here, I came over to this country May 29th, 1964, in the SS United States. It was one of the first Atlantic crossings, a ship which had stabilizers. Wonderful. Okay? This was an advancement in transatlantic crossings. I believe that ship is moored somewhere off the coast of California somewhere now. I'm not sure where it went, but anyway. So he did not have that luxury. This boat was rocking from side to side. It wasn't a very sturdy boat. And anyway, they finally arrived. The first port of call for them was actually Halifax, not on here, where the ship unloaded its cargo for Canada. His next port of call was in fact Boston. And Boston was probably one of the first ports of call that actually give us some interest as to his reason for being here, or a little bit of interest anyway. However, on landing, there are some evidence. You know, history is never the truth. Have you found that? History never is the complete truth. Anyway, there's some evidence that he stayed on board for at least 2 days, which makes me think, why? Why 2 days? Because it's now on terra firma. Why 2 days? My opinion is that they were there trying to get themselves clean. Get themselves, get rid of the smells. But they were also very sick. It was to do a little bit of recovery, you see. Get some extra brandy. And then be ready for the onslaught. They knew there was an onslaught because on, I think, the second day that they were on board, the press, the paparazzi showed up, and they boarded that ship. He didn't realize this was coming. Didn't realize this. So, and you know the story. You know what paparazzi can do to people. We've heard in our current history with Diane, for instance, Princess Diane, or any other notable, they can kill you. Not that Dickens knew that, of course not, but so anyway, he disembarks from the ship, and he's taken by those who are going to entertain him and take care of him to a hotel called the Tremont, not Tremont, Tremont, where he's given the luxury of some great, beautiful suite, and his first reaction was, actually when he got there, again, going back to his ego, he and his wife, when they were approaching the door, he threw up his hands and said, "We're here!" That's very un-English to do that. Again, it's his ego talking, We're here! So in they go, and the thing that impressed him the most was, of course, this Tremont Hotel. It happened to be one of the first on American record that had running water. It may have been an assistant on the roof, and it was pumped down through gravity and heated with gas, but it was there, it was available. It had separate rooms, it had all the modern conveniences that any hotel that would have at that time. He just thought it was wonderful. He was bowled over by this, and he was a very happy man at that moment. Right? So going on from there, he actually only stayed, he didn't stay for very long in Boston. He was bombarded by the press, but while he was on board the Britannia, he had got word somehow, and I don't know how this happened, that there was a portrait painter who wanted to paint his portrait. Well, that appealed to Dickens, so yeah, was in for the portrait. So he spent some time in this hotel being painted by a portrait painter by the name of Alexander, well known apparently at the time. And along with Alexander, there was a sculptor who was going around with, measuring his face, going around this way, that way. So at the same time he was being painted, he was being sculpted. In addition to that, Dickens was now being bombarded with letter after letter after letter. He was now, he had arrived. And he looked at the pile of letters and he said, can't handle that. I need somebody to help me. And Alexander, the portrait painter, said, well, I've got a student here. He's got nothing better to do. So he volunteered the student. He was a young man who actually then became part of Dickens' entourage as he travelled through these cities. And he was, answering all his letters and being a general gopher for him, you see, which Dickens did appreciate. But as time went on, he was entertained a lot. He was given a lot of parties, balls, come to dinner. He was going around really doing the social thing. Now, historically, that really isn't terribly interesting. That's why I say this trip did him, in the long run, more harm than good, which you'll find out in the end that it did. He was continuing to be bombarded, though, those that wanted to touch him, those that wanted a lock of his hair, I'm just going to digress a minute here. Keep that, a lock of his hair. And I'm going to go back just to, this is a little bit of the naughtiness that I see in Dickens. It's got nothing to do with this. But before it was the custom when a young woman got married in England to perhaps have some household help, especially when you're expecting your first baby 9 months later, No birth control. Well, there was actually, but that's another story. So it was a custom to have somebody come in and help. Well, his wife had 2 sisters, a young one called Mary, lovely looking young thing, and Dickens quite fancied her, you know what I mean. So she was on board in his household. Unfortunately, she was a sick, very sickly young girl, and died very young. Dickens was there at her death. He held her while she died. He cried over her while she died. He then took her clothing, kept it, smelled it, rustled it, touched it, put it around himself, and took a lock of her hair. He carried that lock of her hair with him till the day he died. If that man had been alive today and we'd known all that today, he would be put away. Right? This is not normal behavior. So what was he really doing with this young girl? Did he have a penchant for young girls, What was going on? This is why I think of this man as something other than we really know about him. But then so she dies, and then they get the next sister. But she was more, he didn't quite fancy her, so she was okay. All right, that was just an aside. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the other thing the very prominent thing that happened in Boston was there's an institute called the Perkins Institute, which you may all know of. And it has an institute for the deaf, dumb and blind, where a lot of young men and women were going there for counselling, teaching and education. It was well run. It was one of the first graduates, if you will, was a young lady who was very successful in her accomplishments, very, very intelligent, and the school became a fixture. It became well known. Dickens, he was a social, he really wanted to be a social reformer. He was a social reformer. But, in my way of thinking, he rode the crest of this wave in order to satisfy his ego. There was a kind of a double life that he had with all of these. It isn't just my way of thinking. But, so he really did like this Perkins Institute, though. And he gave a considerable amount of money to it, which was very nice. Later on, it was 40 years later, if you remember, Helen Keller.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was a graduate of the Perkins Institute. And just as an aside, I learned this from Valerie's brother, Terry Risch, that he told me that Helen Keller made a couple of appearances and lectures at the Ryman Auditorium. So here we have a Nashville connection. And I didn't know that. I learned a lot from my brother. That's just another aside. So then he also, inside the Perkins Institute, they had something called an embosser, where they were trying to type out books and stuff. And then Dickens very kindly offered, because there was no copyright, you really had to give your permission for anything to be done on your behalf. And he said that they could print as many copies as they liked of the Old Curiosity Shop. So that was probably the first Braille book we know of that came to the United States was Dickens, the Old Curiosity Shop. So that, the Perkins Institute, actually there are several of these institutes scattered all over the world now. Very, very prominent institution. And it's still there. So if you're ever in Boston, look it up. There's probably a museum attached. You can probably find some interesting stuff in there again. So that was one of the things that he, that was really went on in Boston. He also took a lot of walks around. He loved Boston. He thought it was colourful. He loved the houses. And when you ever, even today, if you were to go back to the UK and go to any house or any building, the whole house could be half the size of this room. They were built from God knows when, small, to really contain the heat, because there was no heating, that sort of thing. But of course here in the United States, things were different, So he loved the big rooms. He just loved the colours of the houses. And he loved to walk, and he did so. But that was really pretty much all he did in Boston. And then he goes on to, I think he goes on to New York next, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay. He goes on to New York, and he's greeted again by hundreds of people. He's getting a bit fed up with it now. It's a little bit too much. And he's beginning to feel the pressure of all these people in attendance. They give him a ball, a huge, what it's called, his nickname was Boz, by the way, which he adopted from one of his younger brothers who couldn't pronounce his name, his own name. His own name was Moses. And he had a cold or some kind of nasal thing, and he couldn't pronounce the M, so he can, so Dickens liked that, and he adopted that nickname called Boz. So anyway, they gave him this enormous party in New York, at, they called it the Boss Ball. And hundreds of people showed up. And he danced the night through, and he did have a good time. And that's recorded, how well he danced with his wife, who he still loved at that time. He only had 4 children by then, most of which he despised later on. He thought they were leeches. That's another story, okay. Anyway, but there was also another. He had a taste for the unusual. He had a taste for the macabre. And there was a place in New York called the 5 Points. And he would go down, this was a place of absolute debauchery, prostitution, pickpockets. And you know, Dickens knew a lot about pickpocketing. If you read Oliver Twist, you know, where did he learn this, do you know? He, through observation, and maybe he even had a go at it, who knows? But this is the sort of thing that he thrived on. He thrived on the macabre, the paranormal, and the abnormal. There's something very strange about this man. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Okay? So, he goes down to the 5 Points, which, if anybody knows New York at all, is called Foley Street. And there is still today a restaurant there called the 5 Points Restaurant. So if you ever go there, go down there and think of that, you know. Of course, it's changed now, the area got a bit more gentrified, and the prostitutes have moved further north, you know. But, I think they're in Times Square now. Anyway, so there's really not much else he does in New York, except get entertained. More parties, more dinners, more adulation. But he's still getting tired of this. He's not a strong man, remember. He really isn't considered to be a very strong man. So it's time to move on. Now he's going down to Philadelphia, where he only spends 3 days there. And he goes to look at, where does he want to go? He wants to go and visit penitentiaries. He wants to go and visit those that are incarcerated, have little chats with them, see what, you know, weird things he can get out of them. You know, this is what he likes. This is what makes him thrive. So, but Philadelphia as a city, you know, by that time, you know, the Americans now, everything's going on time, exactly. And Philadelphia is built on a grid. Everything's north, south, east, west, which Dickens noticed right away. And after he'd had a few walks along what he called a boring city, he longed for a crooked street. But what did he come here for, you know? Did he come to see the new republic or not, you know? You can't come to a country and wish you were back home, you know? This is what I didn't like about him. You go to a country and you're received as a guest, you know, you make the best of it, not bring out what... Anyway, it's another reason I don't like him. The other thing about Philadelphia is that he actually met Edgar Allan Poe there for the first time, and they had quite a lot in common, and they did the walkabouts, you know. Bonnie might like to know that. She loves Edgar Allan Poe, don't you? And in Philadelphia there are a couple of statues, I believe, of one maybe of Dickens, but also in their library. They still have the Dickens pet bird. You know, Dickens had a bird, a pet bird, which he called Grip. Yeah, it was a raven.
Oh, wow.
And that bird is stuffed and is in the library in Philadelphia. Any time you go to Philadelphia, go and visit Grip, okay? Just a little addition, okay? But he only stayed a few days there. And he went on to, also, today, they have something called the Dickens Fellowship, which is an institution. If you like Dickens, you join this, like a club, really, you know, which was managed one time by one of Dickens' great-great-great-grandchildren by the name of Cedric Dickens. Now, I knew Cedric. I had a lot of communication with him, and I had a lot of asides about Dickens, things that are not published, not known. He knew, I knew, and unfortunately he died about 3 or 4 years ago. But the fellowship is still there. It's for those who love Dickens, who want to get their newsletters, you know, the sort of thing. It's still there. So that's what's left in Philadelphia. Other than that, it was more partying, more tea times, you know. Dickens was still getting a bit fed up with this whole thing, and his temperament was beginning to change. So now, he goes to Baltimore, and he's impressed with the buildings, you know. But from then he goes to Washington, and of course this is where he goes to the White House. At the time, it was President Tyler, who was the president of the day, the 10th president of the United States, and he had a kind of an audition with him, if you will, and noticed that the carpets in the White House were filthy. And you know why they were filthy? Because there was a lot of spitting that went on over here at the time. It seemed to be a cultural phenomenon over here. Tobacco chewing. And the guys were just chewing, you know, everywhere. They didn't care where they spat, even in the White House. And Davy Crockett was one of the most prominent. He did it more than anybody, because he was known, you know. He liked to spit. So, but this is where he brings up, he had a great dinner in the White House, you know. And this is where he brings up, maybe for the first time, we're not really sure, about the copyright inside Congress. He visits Congress, and he approaches Congress and puts it to them. You know, let's have copyright. Well, it's a very complicated law, very complicated, pages and pages and pages. But suffice to say that in order for somebody to publish a book, if you make another copy, or copies are made and sold, the author should get a little something for his effort, or her effort. That wasn't happening. But so the idea of adding cost to this was not well received by the Americans. First of all, they had no funding for this sort of thing to execute a law. And in the second place, they didn't want to pay for anything. They were doing very well by having piracy. Why pay for it when you can get it for free? Now, a lot of men have heard that before, right? Sorry. So anyway, so that's that's when he really brings up this business of copywriting. Interestingly enough, he is not, after that approach, and after he's sort of turned down and looked at with anathema, you know, by Americans now, he's beginning to lose face. He's not liked anymore. They consider Dickens to be a money grubber. He's only here to make money. Who does he think he is, you know? So his reputation begins to flounder. So he's not a happy man. Now he begins to look at the United States and its people in a slightly different way. Not good. But he goes on. He leaves Washington. He now goes down to Richmond. The one thing that Dickens had absolute hate for was slavery. Slavery had been abolished, or at least the slave trade. There's a difference here. The slave trade had been abolished long before anything happened here. So he went to Richmond and he saw, oh dear, have I offended her? He went to Richmond and he saw the evidence of how people of colour, men and women of colour, were treated, how abused they were, how physically abused they were in every way, and it horrified him. He, quote, said it was odious. So again, he was now getting a very negative impression. It was adding to his negativity of this country. And so that's really all he saw in Richmond, was the evidence of slavery. And I think there's a little story, and I can't remember where I saw this. He was approaching a bridge, and apparently there may have been a small toll to get over this bridge. If you were white, you got over free, but if you were a person of colour, you had to pay. Horrified him, horrified him. He then now he's going backtracking. He backtracks to a number of these cities. He goes back to Washington, then of course he has to cross over. He wants to see the prairies. And of course the further away you get from Boston, the less population. He was getting relieved, not so many people behind him, He was getting a little relief from this. So he took a boat trip, on one of these paddle steamers along the Erie Canal. And he was on that for God knows how long, enjoying their fruits, dinners and parties and a rest. So he gets to Cincinnati, another city which he thinks is beautiful. Not much to say about that either, He wants to go to Canada. I'm leaving a lot of this stuff out because, excuse me, hang on a second. Oh yes, have to. He then goes on to Canada, where he arrives in Montreal as his first stop. And he goes either by train, there are a lot of trains here at that time, or by boat, or by steamer. One way or another, he gets to Montreal, where he's invited to join a troupe of actors to perform in 3 plays, right up his alley. Right up, because he really was an actor. He actually was in several plays in London. He was also a magician. This was right up his alley. So he joined this troupe of performers. That's what he did in Montreal. He went on to Quebec, same thing. He just loved it. But before that, he did go to Niagara Falls, where he thought this was just a wonder, a God's wonder, and he actually allowed himself to get wet, there, which I think he himself recorded. We don't know about his wife, By that time he didn't want to throw her overboard, but So really, when you sum this whole thing up, his visit to the United States, in substance, really wasn't that much, because he was now considered the bad boy. He was no good, but he wanted to make something out of this. And that was, he thought, was one of, according to record, was one of his intentions over here, was to come over, see the great new republic, see how they had cured all the ills of the other side of the Atlantic, write about it, and present it as a book. Well, he did do that in it's called American Notes, where he did write about it, but the final blow came when he wrote this book called Martin Chuzzlewit, which is a scathing report of this country, absolutely scathing. You have to read it. That's the sum total of this visit. He didn't get anywhere with his copyright. That came 50 years later, if you can believe it. 50 years it took for this whole legal thing to come to fruition. So that failed. His visit pretty much failed. He himself was weak and not happy. So when he went back, he took it out of the United States in Martin Chuzzlewit. However, there is a little bit of the light shining through here, because you know the Americans are great at forgiveness. They really are. They love to, they forgive and forget. I learned that when I came here. You know, the British, they hold on to they go around with these miserable faces forever. They're holding a grudge, you know that, you know. Not the Americans. They forgive and forget easily. And this is what happened over the years. They did forgive. They did forget. And they kept on reading his books as they came out. And they continued to love him. So when he came back, he sent a scout out on the before his second visit. He sent a scout in. What do you think? You think the Americans would have me back? And yes, he got the affirmation that he would be very welcomed again. They were always forgiven. So he came back, and this time it was a whole different story. And it ended up very well for everybody. But that first visit was not a good one, and the hour is up. I can't talk anymore. And if there's anything you'd like to know, please say so now before I run out of voice. Okay?
You got water in that ear.
Yeah, thank you. Good reminder. Thank you. It's been an hour. I've been mouthing off about this man, his trip, which really didn't turn out so well for him. But in the end, it all turned out well. And in the end, we did get copyright, which became international. And everybody benefited from this. And that kind of rolled over. It had an effect on songwriters today. Everything that's been written, that copyright has had a tremendous impact on our society at large, you know. So we have to thank him for at least starting the fire burning for the copyright.
Ahead of his time.
That's about it. That's all I have